David paced nervously around the living room, holding his phone in hand. His thumb hovered over the screen as he waited for the call to go through. "Hi, sweetheart, how's the conference going?" he asked when the line connected. His voice was soft, but with a barely noticeable tension. His gaze drifted over the familiar photos on the walls, wedding pictures, vacations, and other happy moments they once shared together. In the background, he could hear muffled sounds, likely coming from the crowd near Emily. "Everything's fine. I just finished a session. I'll call you later," she replied curtly, as if rushing to end the conversation. David stopped, and the silence between them grew heavier with every passing second. "Okay," he said hesitantly. Something in her voice felt off, as if she wasn't fully engaged. "Love you," he added, but there was an uncertainty in his words that he couldn't shake. "Love you too," she said, but her words sounded hollow, missing the warmth he so longed to hear. After the call ended, David stared at the phone for a few more minutes, his brow furrowed in thought. Something was bothering him, but he couldn't quite grasp what it was. Sighing, he flopped onto the couch, setting the phone aside and rubbing his temples in frustration. Emily had been distant for 3 months now, and David kept trying to convince himself it was just a temporary phase. Her new job required constant travel and long hours, which had put a strain on their relationship, but David reassured himself that it was only temporary. Oscar, his childhood friend, often told him the same thing. "She's just getting used to the new role. It's tough at first, but things will settle down," Oscar would say in his usual calm, confident voice, and David believed him. Why wouldn't he? Oscar had been his best friend since childhood, and Emily was his wife, the woman he had promised forever to. There was no real reason to doubt her, right? David's thoughts drifted back to the early days of their relationship. He remembered how Emily used to send him little messages throughout the day, just to let him know she was thinking of him. They would talk late into the night, plan spontaneous dates, and laugh together over the silliest things. Those moments felt so distant now, but he clung to them, hoping this was just a rough patch. "We're just going through a tough time," he muttered to himself, trying to calm the growing unease in his chest. But despite his words, the anxiety wouldn't go away. Suddenly, the phone buzzed, startling him. Emily was calling again. His heart raced as he answered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Hello," he said, but all he heard in return was static. David almost dismissed the call, thinking it was a pocket dial, but then he caught faint sounds, distant voices breaking through the static. He strained to listen, trying to figure out what was happening. When suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, shockingly clear. "Does your husband really think you're at work?" What an idiot. David froze in place. Those words hit him like a punch to the gut, and it took a few seconds for him to process what he'd just heard. That voice, he recognized it. Oscar. As the static faded, the voices became clearer. "That fool pays for everything while you enjoy yourself in bed with me," Oscar said with a low chuckle. That laugh, Oscar's laugh, sent a wave of horror through David. His pulse quickened, his fingers clenched around the phone, and his hand began to tremble. This couldn't be real. There had to be some kind of mistake. But before he could gather his thoughts, he heard another voice that made his blood run cold. It was Emily, his wife. Her voice was soft, familiar, but it now carried a cruel edge that he'd never heard before. "He's too dumb to realize that I haven't been in this marriage for a long time. Don't even mention him, he disgusts me," Emily said. And her words stabbed David like a knife. In that moment, his world collapsed. His mouth went dry, his heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the rest of the conversation. Emily's laughter echoed in the air, each sound becoming more painful. It wasn't just laughter, it was mockery. His hand went numb, and the phone slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the floor. He stood paralyzed, his mind racing for a reason, an excuse, anything to explain what he had just heard. Oscar and Emily, his wife and his best friend, the two people he trusted more than anyone, how long had they been hiding this from him? How long had he been living this lie? David collapsed onto the edge of the couch, burying his head in his hands, overwhelmed by disbelief. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the photo frames, the memories of the life he thought was his. Every smile, every precious moment now seemed poisoned by betrayal. But what echoed loudest in his mind was Emily's laughter. That laughter haunted him, mocking him as if he were a fool in some cruel game. Their whole life suddenly felt like a performance, with Oscar, the man he considered a brother, playing the role of an accomplice. Every shared moment, dinners, conversations, memories, now felt like venom. How many times had the three of them sat at the same table, laughing, while this betrayal unfolded right under his nose? How many times had Oscar looked him in the eye, all the while secretly betraying him? David's world, once solid and secure, now felt like it had been built on quicksand. The betrayal was complete, and all he could hear was the cruel echo of Emily's laughter. David clenched his fingers, the tendons in his hands tightening as his fists closed and his knuckles turned white from the strain. A wave of rage surged within him like a fire suddenly ignited, threatening to consume him with its intensity. For a moment, he wanted to break something, anything, to release the anger overwhelming him. But as quickly as the heat rose, it dissipated, giving way to a strange, methodical calm. No, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. They thought they had outsmarted him, made him a fool. They had no idea what awaited them. Slowly, he rose to his feet, every movement deliberate, as if controlled by an invisible force. His eyes fell on the phone lying on the floor, and with a slow, calculated gesture, he picked it up and placed it back on the table without even glancing at the screen. His thoughts were already shifting, forming a plan. Direct confrontation was too easy, too predictable. They didn't deserve to witness his pain. No, they would feel the full weight of their betrayal in a way they would never forget. When he was done, they would regret ever crossing him. His chest filled with heaviness, a cold hardness settled inside him as he moved down the hallway towards the bedroom. He opened the closet and stared at Emily's things, dresses, shoes, remnants of a life that now felt empty and fake without her. Without hesitation, he reached for the suitcase on the top shelf and placed it on the bed. His hands moved precisely, methodically, folding her clothes with a chilling calm. Each item he packed felt like peeling away another layer of his former life. Her favorite dress, the one she wore for their anniversary dinner, was tossed in without a second thought. When the suitcase was full, he zipped it up and stepped back, surveying the room. It now felt empty, just like him. Taking a deep breath, David picked up the phone again. His voice was calm as he contacted a courier service to arrange for the suitcase to be sent the next day. The message that would accompany the package was brief but final: now your home is the street. Goodbye. The house was quiet, but for the first time, David felt an unsettling calm inside. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. He sank into a chair in the kitchen, his gaze fixed on the wall, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Once again, the phone lay silently before him, its screen dark, showing no signs of the recent chaos. But David's mind kept replaying the words he'd overheard: Oscar's smug voice, Emily's cruel laugh, like a knife stabbing him over and over again. The oppressive silence of the house pressed down on him, interrupted only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock. But those sounds faded into the background as his thoughts spiraled in mercy loops. David lost track of time, slipping into a trance-like state where disbelief mingled with growing but controlled anger. At first, his thoughts were scattered, stunned by the shock of what was happening. However, gradually, they began to fall into place. Every late night Emily spent out of the house, every innocent piece of advice Oscar had given, and all the subtle changes in their behavior over the past few months, it all started to make sense. What had once seemed harmless now appeared blatantly obvious. "They think I don't notice," he whispered to himself. His voice was barely audible, but cut through the silence of the room like a knife. His jaw clenched, and the paralysis of shock started giving way to a rising fury. But this anger wasn't chaotic or uncontrolled. No, David wasn't going to make a rash scene. That would be too easy, too predictable, and they'd probably laugh about it later. Moving with deliberate intent, David stood from his chair. Each movement was precise, as though he were holding back a storm that could break loose at any moment. He wasn't going to let them walk away from this unscathed. He would not play the role of the pathetic, deceived husband they probably imagined him to be. His resolve hardened, and that night, sleep didn't come to him. His mind worked ceaselessly, forming a strategy that evolved with every passing second. If they were willing to gamble his life for their game, he would make sure they paid dearly for it. They wouldn't even see it coming. David spent the rest of the night at his computer, meticulously planning his next steps. He made a list of divorce attorneys, drafted precise emails, and noted every legal action he needed to take. His first call the next morning was to an attorney. His voice was calm and steady, with not a single emotion slipping through his words. "I need the most ironclad restraining order you can draw up," David demanded. His tone was cold and certain. "Understood," the attorney responded, already making notes. "We'll start preparing the documents immediately." "Do you have proof of the affair?" the attorney asked. David's lips twitched slightly. "I have a recording," he replied. There was a brief pause on the other end, filled with a hint of surprise. "That will help a great deal. We'll file this as a breach of trust. We'll make sure the divorce is swift and severe," the attorney assured him. After the call ended, David allowed himself a brief, bitter smile. He wasn't just going to end his 30-year marriage, he wanted Emily and Oscar to feel the full weight of their betrayal. The next day, David acted at work as if nothing had changed. He greeted his colleagues with his usual friendly smile, engaged in light conversation in the break room, and even laughed at a joke about one of his projects. To everyone around him, he was still the same David, but beneath the surface, every word, every smile felt hollow. His thoughts were entirely consumed by the plan unfolding before him. During lunch, he quietly excused himself, stepping outside to take care of some urgent business. Without attracting attention, he made the necessary calls, ranging from a team of movers to arrive later that night. He had deliberately chosen a company known for its efficiency and precision, ensuring that everything would be completed before Emily returned from her business trip. That evening, having finished all his affairs, David drove home. As he approached the house with an outwardly calm and confident demeanor, he could still feel his heart pounding wildly in his chest. The moving truck was already parked by the curb, waiting for him. David approached the head mover and, after unlocking the door, gave instructions, "Only the boxes from the bedroom, be careful with everything." The crew immediately got to work, moving with purpose. David stood off to the side, arms crossed, silently watching as they packed Emily's belongings into neat boxes, her clothes, her shoes, even the photo she had insisted on hanging in the bedroom. All were packed without a moment's hesitation. As David walked through the house, he couldn't help but notice the bitter irony. Once, Emily had proclaimed that this house would be their forever home. Now, the house felt like an empty shell, their life together reduced to boxes and tape. Inside, David felt no sadness, only a firm resolve. By the time the movers finished, several hours had passed. David stood in the living room, surveying the empty spaces where Emily's things had once been. He made sure that nothing was left behind, so that when Emily returned, it would feel as if she had been completely erased from the house. "That's all, sir," the lead mover said, handing him the final bill. David nodded quickly, wrote a check, and handed it over. "Take everything to this address," he said, offering a scrap of paper with Oscar's address. The mover raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "Understood," he replied. David watched as the truck pulled away, carrying Emily's belongings into the night. As it disappeared from sight, David's racing pulse slowed, replaced by a deep, serene sense of finality. This was only the beginning. David went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. He pulled up the photos he had taken earlier, capturing the empty house, the bare bedroom, the spotless living room, and the cleared-out closet. He printed them and carefully laid them next to the divorce papers on the table. The final touch was the note he had written beforehand, "You deserve nothing, goodbye." He placed it on top of the stack and paused for a moment, staring at it. It wasn't poetic, but it didn't need to be. It was done. The truth had finally surfaced. That same evening, when the house was enveloped in an ominous silence, David quietly packed his suitcase. He had no intention of staying there when Emily returned. He wasn't going to give her the chance to cry, beg, or come up with excuses for her actions. Everything had spiraled out of his control before leaving for good. Before leaving, David did one last thing. He blocked Emily's number and then Oscar's too. Neither of them would be able to reach him, and they would have no opportunity to ask for his forgiveness. They had taken everything from him, and now it was his turn to take something from them. As he closed the door behind him, a surprising lightness washed over him. The man he once was, the one who trusted too easily, believed in love and loyalty, was gone. In his place stood someone colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. He got behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. By the time Emily and Oscar realized what had happened, he would be nothing more than a distant memory. They thought they had one, but this was only the beginning. Emily pulled into the driveway, exhausted after her business trip. She was ready to return to her routine, smile at David, and continue their charade. The lies weighed on her, but they had become almost second nature, almost easy. As she stepped out of the car with her keys in hand, something felt off. The house was completely dark. David always left the lights on for her. She brushed off the strange feeling and headed to the front door, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. She opened the door, expecting the familiar warmth of home. Instead, she was greeted by an unsettling silence. The house didn't feel the same. The usual comfort was missing, and there seemed to be a chill lingering in the air. "David," she called out, dropping her bag by the door. Silence. Confused, Emily walked through the living room, glancing around. Everything seemed the same, the couch, the TV, the dining table, but something was wrong. Small familiar details were missing. Her shoes weren't by the door, her coat wasn't hanging on the hook, and the perfume bottles on the shelf were gone. Everything had disappeared, even the photos from their wedding and vacations. A wave of terror swept over her. She rushed to the bedroom, her heart pounding as she flung open the closet doors. Her side was empty, no dresses, no shoes, nothing was left. Panic began to rise in her chest. She hurried back to the living room, frantically digging through her purse for her phone. Emily tried dialing David's number, but instead of an answer, she heard the familiar voice of his voicemail. She tried again, but the result was the same. "What the hell is going on?" she muttered to herself, staring at the screen as if it could provide answers. Her anxiety grew as she typed a message, her fingers trembling with fear. "David, where are you? Call me back immediately. This isn't funny." Seconds stretched into minutes, each one feeling like an eternity, as she waited for any kind of response. Her mind raced, and Emily paced nervously across the living room. Something was clearly wrong, and she felt it deep within her. Where was he? But true terror gripped her when she noticed something strange. All of her belongings were gone. Panic surged as she rushed to the kitchen, and there, on the table, lay a stack of documents. Her heart stopped, divorce papers, and on top of them was a photograph with a note attached. Her stomach churned as she recognized the image. It was a picture of her, Oscar, and David, smiling at last year's barbecue. The memory washed over her like a wave. They had seemed so happy then, so invincible. But now the photo mocked her, a cruel reminder of the lies that had destroyed their world. Next to the photograph, her eyes were drawn to a small note. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her hands shook as she picked it up, fear tightening in her chest. The message was sharp, biting, and dripping with venom. "Your new home is the street. Goodbye." Emily's eyes lingered on those words, their pain cutting deep into her soul. It was as if they were shouting at her, delivering a cruel sentence from which there was no escape. She had been sure she'd been careful, sure that David would never learn the truth. But she was wrong, so very, very wrong. The phone slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. Her heart raced in her chest, her breathing becoming fast and erratic. David knew there was no going back now. But how had he uncovered her secret? In a daze, she struggled to dial Oscar's number, her fingers barely responded. He answered on the third ring, his voice calm, unaware of the chaos looming. "Hey, what's going on?" Emily's voice trembled as she asked, barely holding back her panic. "What the hell is happening?" Emily began to speak, her words pouring out in a rush. Her voice trembled with fear. Oscar froze, confusion written on his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "David," she blurted out sharply, her tone laced with irritation. "He's gone. Oscar, all my things are missing. The divorce papers are on the kitchen table. How could he have found out?" Oscar didn't respond immediately, the silence between them thickened, the tension growing. Emily felt the weight of his hesitation pressing down on her. Then there was a barely audible sound from the side, followed by an unsettling stillness. "Oscar, Emily," her voice wavered, her throat tightening with anxiety. "What's happening?" Wait," Oscar stammered, and there was the creak of a door. Emily started pacing nervously, biting her lip in frustration. Her nerves were on edge, her hands shook so badly she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. When Oscar spoke again, his voice was quiet, more cautious. "Oh no, what happened?" Emily demanded, her heart pounding wildly. "It looks like David sent your things here," Oscar's voice was tense. "There's a truck outside, they're unloading boxes with your name on them." Emily felt the ground drop out from beneath her, it became hard to breathe. "Tell me this is some kind of awful joke," she whispered. "It's not a joke," Oscar muttered, his voice full of defeat. "There's a photo stuck to one of the boxes from that barbecue of the two of us." Emily didn't need to ask which photo it was, the same one that had been lying on her kitchen table. She whispered almost to herself, "He knows everything, he knows it all." Oscar's reply was barely a whisper, "Yes, he knows." Without a moment's hesitation, Emily ended the call and ran out of the house. The drive to Oscar's house blurred by like a haze, her thoughts spinning wildly. When she arrived, the truck was still parked outside. The sight made her stomach turn. The boxes were stacked on Oscar's lawn, her name clearly written on each one. She stepped out of the car, her legs like jelly as she walked toward the pile. Oscar stood on the porch, arms crossed, his face unreadable. They didn't exchange a word, there was no need. Emily turned to him and whispered, barely audible, "What do we do now?" Oscar ran his fingers through his hair, releasing a heavy, frustrated sigh. "I don't know, Emily. He's gone, he's not answering my calls either." Emily bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears. She couldn't hold back. "He can't just disappear," she whispered. Oscar shook his head, a resigned expression etched on his face. "Emily, he's furious. You saw what he wrote in the note. He's not coming back." For the first time, the full weight of what she had done hit her. She had destroyed everything, her marriage, her life with David, for what? A fleeting affair that had long since lost its spark. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the porch steps, burying her face in her hands. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling, barely audible. Oscar stood silently beside her, watching as she fell apart. He had no comforting words, no solution to offer. What had once been a passionate, forbidden romance had spiraled into complete chaos. There was nothing left to save. They sat in oppressive silence, feeling the full weight of their situation. David was gone, and with his departure, everything they had known crumbled. Emily's gaze fell on the scattered boxes across the lawn. Her hands were clutching the divorce papers. In one reckless moment, she had lost everything, and there was no way back. She retreated to the bedroom, sliding down against the wall and gripping her phone tightly in her trembling hands. Her mind raced with thoughts, and the silence around her only amplified the regrets and the weight of her mistakes. David's words from the note echoed in her mind over and over again, like a fresh wound. This couldn't be the end. She couldn't let it all end like this. There had to be a way to make him understand, to somehow fix it all. David wasn't the kind of man who left without a fight. He had always loved her, despite the ups and downs. It couldn't be possible that everything they had built had fallen apart this way. With shaking hands, Emily scrolled through her phone contacts and dialed David's number once again. Her heart raced with each ring, 1, 2, 3, but there was no answer. She cursed under her breath, feeling the tears threatening to fall. Panic overwhelmed her, and she hit redial, pleading, praying that he would pick up. It felt like an eternity before the ringing stopped, and his voice came through cold and distant. "What do you want, Emily?" The sound of his voice washed over her like a wave, leaving her breathless. For a moment, Emily had mentally rehearsed this conversation so many times that she'd lost count, imagining every possible outcome. But now, with David on the line, her mind felt blank. She struggled to find the right words, tears welling up in her eyes as she forced herself to speak. "David, please give me a chance to explain," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I know I hurt you deeply. I know what I did is unforgivable." But David's response was immediate and harsh, cutting her off mid-sentence. His voice was cold, filled with anger and bitterness. "A mistake? Do you really think that's what this was, Emily?" He didn't wait for her reply. "It wasn't just a mistake, you destroyed everything we had. You lied to me, betrayed me, and slept with Oscar. And now you think I'll sit here and listen to you?" "Please, David," she pleaded, barely holding her voice together. "I'm so sorry, I regret it more than you could ever imagine." It was a moment of weakness. David laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. "A moment of weakness? Don't insult me by calling it that. People don't cheat by accident, Emily." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. The weight of his anger and disappointment was unbearable, and she realized just how deep the wounds she had caused ran. Emily knew this wouldn't be easy, but she had to try. She had to make him see how truly sorry she was. "I understand that you're furious," she whispered, wiping away the tears now streaming down her cheeks. "I know you probably hate me right now, but can't we at least talk about this? We can fix it, David. I'll do whatever it takes to repair what I've broken." For a moment, there was silence on the other end, and Emily allowed herself a sliver of hope. Maybe he was thinking about her words, maybe they could have a real conversation like before, but when David spoke again, his tone was colder than before. "There's nothing to fix, Emily," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I'm done." Her heart clenched painfully, her breath caught. "Please, David, don't say that. Don't let it end like this. You should have thought about that before you went behind my back." David continued, his voice relentless. "You and Oscar, you're perfect for each other. Don't ever contact me again." "No, David," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything, please. Just listen to me. Let's talk. Don't do this." The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily barely breathed, desperately hoping for some sign that he might give her another chance, but when David finally spoke again, his words were like a dagger to her heart. "Goodbye, Emily." The line went dead. She stared at the phone, the realization crashing down on her like a heavy weight. It was truly, completely over. When Emily dropped the phone, the persistent sound of the dial tone echoed in her ears. Her trembling fingers couldn't hold on to it, and with a soft thud, it fell to the floor. The full realization of what had just happened crashed over her like a wave, and she collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. It was over. David was gone. Everything she knew had disappeared. She couldn't catch her breath, her chest tightening with every sob. How had it come to this? How had she let everything spiral out of control? She never believed that David would discover the truth, and even if he did, she had convinced herself that he would find it in his heart to forgive her again, just like all the times before. He had always turned a blind eye to her small transgressions, forgotten holidays, broken promises, harsh words spoken in anger. But this time was different. There would be no forgiveness. Curled up on the floor, her tears soaked into the carpet, and her mind replayed the moments of her deceit over and over. The lies, the secrets, the fleeting thrill she had shared with Oscar now seemed like the worst decision of her life. How had she sunk so low? The phone rang again, but it wasn't David, it was Oscar. Wiping her streaked face, she hesitated for a moment before answering. What do you want? Her voice was hollow and lifeless. Emily, I spoke to him. Oscar's voice was tense this time. He's serious. He's not coming back. He filed for divorce. She muttered, her voice barely audible. Oscar sighed on the other end. What do we do now? Emily didn't know. She was completely lost. I don't know, she admitted. He's gone, Oscar. He hates me. Oscar was silent for a few seconds before speaking again. Maybe we can still explain things to him, tell him what really happened. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Fresh tears blurred Emily's vision, and she squeezed her eyes shut. He doesn't care anymore. He doesn't want to listen to us. In his mind, it's already over. The finality of her own words crushed her. David had always been her rock, the one constant in her life, and now he was gone. Oscar's voice softened, full of regret. I'm so sorry, Emily, this was never part of the plan. It doesn't matter anymore, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. It's too late. Without waiting for more empty apologies, she ended the call. What good were they when everything was already destroyed? The life she had built with David, the trust that once defined their relationship, was shattered beyond repair. Slowly forcing herself, she got up from the floor, her legs trembling. The house felt emptier than ever before, as though every trace of the life it once protected had been erased. Emily wandered through the empty rooms, barely touching the surfaces that had once been filled with her things. Now, everything seemed foreign, distant, as if this place no longer had any connection to her. Eventually, she found herself back in the kitchen, her gaze resting on the divorce papers lying on the table. At the bottom was David's signature, his handwriting neat and final. Emily ran her fingers over the letters of his name, feeling the weight of reality sink deep into her chest. That was it, it was happening. She had lost him, and nothing could change that now. The phone vibrated again, but this time she didn't even bother checking it. Whoever it was, it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered, the person she loved was gone, and all that was left was the regret of things that couldn't be undone. Meanwhile, Oscar sat alone in his dim living room. The house was filled with an oppressive cold. He stared at the empty wine glass in his hand. The laughter of his children, which once served as comforting background noise to his evenings, had long since faded. Now he was surrounded only by silence and the echo of his own thoughts. His wife had taken the kids and left several days ago, and the house had become unbearably cold without them. He hadn't seen it coming though, looking back, perhaps he should have. The beginning of the end came in the form of an unsigned letter that someone had slipped into Margaret's hand one evening when she was picking up their daughter from school. The note was brief, written in a hurried, uneven script. Your husband is with Emily. Ask David if you need proof. Margaret didn't wait to come home, she called David right then and there. He confirmed everything. The confrontation that followed was something Oscar had never imagined he'd have to face, but now it was forever etched into his memory. Margaret had burst into their home, her face flushed with anger. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? She hissed from the doorway, the crumpled note clenched in her hand. Oscar froze in place, still sitting at the dining table with his laptop open in front of him. He looked up, confused at first, but when their eyes met, a heavy feeling of dread twisted in his gut. "Find out what?" he asked, though the tremble in his voice betrayed the fact that he already knew. Margaret threw the note onto the table. "You were with Emily," she accused. Oscar's gaze fell to the note, his throat dry. He wanted to deny it, to argue against her accusations, but the words wouldn't come. His silence spoke louder than any explanation could. "How could you do this to me? To our family? To our children?" Margaret's voice cracked, her anger breaking under the weight of her pain. Margaret couldn't hold back her sobs, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Oscar, standing across from her, reached out, his eyes filled with a plea. "Margaret, I didn't mean..." he began, but she quickly silenced him with a sharp gesture, stepping back. "Don't even think about touching me." His apology was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't want it to happen like this." Margaret's voice trembled, disbelief quickly replaced by pure anger. "What? You just accidentally ended up in bed with her? Is that your excuse?" Oscar had no answer, no words could justify or undo what had been done. With one careless act, he had destroyed not only his wife's trust but also that of their children and his best friend. And for what? A fleeting affair that lost all its allure the moment it came to light. "I can't be a part of this anymore," Margaret's voice broke, her strength crumbling before his eyes. "I won't stay." With trembling hands, she grabbed her coat and keys, her movements hurried and uncertain. Oscar stood frozen, helpless as he watched her head for the door. "Margaret, please wait," his voice was desperate. His legs shaking, he rushed after her, his heart pounding in his chest. "We can talk, don't leave." She stopped at the door, still facing away from him, her posture tense. "There's nothing left to talk about, Oscar," her words were sharp like a final sentence. "I'm leaving, and the children are coming with me. Don't even think about trying to stop this." Her tone, cold and detached, made the air around them frigid. With a soft click, the door closed behind her, and Oscar felt his entire life slip away with her departure. In the days that followed, Emily moved in with Oscar. She had her own troubles after their affair. All her attempts to reach David had gone unanswered. The only trace of him being the divorce papers, now gathering dust on the kitchen table. The house was sold, and David had vanished without leaving a single clue about his whereabouts. Now, Oscar and Emily, former lovers entangled in their own scandal, sat amidst the wreckage they had created. What had once seemed like an exhilarating secret, stolen moments of forbidden passion, now suffocated them both under the weight of reality. One evening, sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, Emily stared blankly into her glass of wine. Her voice, detached, whispered, "I thought we did it for each other." Her tone was void of any emotion. Oscar let out a deep sigh, pressing his hands to his forehead as if trying to erase the past. "I'm not even sure anymore, Emily. Look at what we've done." Though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew the truth. Their affair, built on lies and deceit, had destroyed everything around them. The excitement was gone, leaving only the cold, hard truth of ruined lives. Margaret had taken the children and left, and Emily's marriage had disintegrated into a pile of unsigned divorce papers. Oscar's career had derailed, the rumors about his scandal spread like wildfire, and his once impeccable reputation, especially among his married clients, was in ruins. No one wanted to deal with him anymore. Almost overnight, his professional prospects vanished. "I can't take this anymore," he muttered one evening, staring blankly at the empty wall in front of him. "It's all over." Emily didn't respond, but the same sadness was reflected in her eyes. Her own life, once full of hopes and ambitions, had now turned into a grim reality. She found herself in a half-empty house with a man she no longer had any feelings for. What once felt thrilling and forbidden had become suffocating, like a prison. The shame weighed heavily on her, but David's absence only deepened that feeling. The day after she moved her things into Oscar's house, David disappeared. He packed up all his belongings and left without a word, no address, no goodbye, not a trace on social media. It was as if he had erased himself completely from their lives. The house was sold within weeks, and the proceeds were quietly transferred to a new account in his name. Oscar tried to reach out to him only once, but the call went unanswered and was sent to voicemail. Leaving a message seemed pointless. David had cut all ties. But his sudden departure wasn't an escape, it was a decisive step toward a new beginning. He settled in a new city where no one knew about his past or the betrayal he had endured. David focused on himself, channeling his energy into reviving his career, improving his health, and ultimately finding happiness. While Oscar and Emily floundered, David thrived. He threw himself into work, eagerly embracing every new opportunity and earning the respect of those around him. His social circle grew, filled with people who valued him for who he had become, not for the mistakes of the past. Time passed, weeks turned into months, and months into years. Gradually, the scars of the past began to heal. David met new people, built meaningful relationships, and slowly found a new love, one built on trust and mutual understanding. It was something he hadn't even realized was missing in his relationship with Emily until everything fell apart. Meanwhile, Oscar's isolation deepened. His marriage to Margaret had been officially dissolved, and she moved far away, taking the children with her. His professional life never recovered. His relationship with Emily became strained, a constant reminder of the destruction they had caused themselves. In the end, she left too, and their paths diverged. Both Oscar and Emily tried to piece together the fragments of their shattered lives, struggling to escape the consequences of their choices. But while they continued to grapple with their bleak reality, David had already moved forward. He had rebuilt his life from scratch, becoming stronger and happier than ever before. The man they once thought of as naive and gullible was now thriving in ways they could never have imagined. Oscar sat alone in his empty house, the void around him a stark contrast to the vibrant life that had once flourished there. Oscar couldn't shake the feeling that everything had slipped through his fingers: his family, his confidant, his successful career. All of it had been torn away by a fleeting affair that cost him everything. Emily was gone, and David had emerged victorious. While David survived the chaos and grew stronger, Oscar remained stuck, buried in the ruins of his own life. Years had passed since the truth came out, since the betrayal shattered lives and severed the fragile threads holding everything together. Both Emily and Oscar bore the scars of what had happened, never fully recovering from the damage. They tried to move on, but the consequences of their choices loomed over them like a dark cloud from which there was no escape. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. Her fingers hovered over David's name in the contact list, the number still saved, despite the years of silence between them. She had lost count of how many times she had tried to reach out, sending messages and leaving voicemails filled with apologies, regret, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. None of them had ever received a response. Oscar had vanished from her life, and their brief attempt at a relationship after the affair had withered in bitterness. The man who once seemed like her salvation had become her prison, intensifying the suffocation she already felt. When they finally parted ways, Emily was left alone, dealing with the aftermath of her decisions. Taking a deep breath, she typed yet another message to David: "I'm sorry. I just want you to know that I'm sorry for everything." Her finger hovered over the send button, fully aware that it would change nothing. David never replied. The familiar sound of a delivered message echoed in the quiet room, and Emily tossed the phone aside, sinking into the bed and staring up at the ceiling. Time had passed, but her life remained frozen in the wreckage of what once was. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw an aging face and eyes dulled by the weight of regret. The pleasure she once chased was long gone, leaving only emptiness in its wake. Her career, once promising and full of potential, had stalled. She still went to work, but the passion that once drove her had evaporated. Friends who once surrounded her had gradually drifted away, taking sides when her affair became public knowledge. Now, she was left alone, steeped in her own misery, with no one to blame but herself. One evening, Emily found herself walking through the city park, the same one where she and David had spent countless weekends together before everything fell apart. The familiar paths stirred memories of laughter and moments stolen on benches when their hands were intertwined. It was a bittersweet sense of longing that gripped her heart, a reminder of the life she had so carelessly thrown away. As she rounded the corner to the lake, her steps slowed, and she came to a stop. Emily stopped, her gaze drifting toward the familiar figure ahead. David stood alone, his hands deeply buried in his pockets, his attention fixed on the ducks gliding across the surface of the pond. There was something peaceful about him now, an assurance, a quiet calm, something Emily hadn't seen in him for a long time. This sight stirred a sudden rush of emotions within her, a sharp reminder of what she once cherished and had lost. Her heart began to race, and for a moment, she thought about stepping back, disappearing before he noticed her presence. But something inside, something stronger than her fear, wouldn't let her turn away. She needed this moment, however fleeting it might be, a closure. She needed to hear his voice one last time. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "David," she called softly. His head turned slowly, his face unreadable as their eyes met. There was no trace of anger, no resentment, just a distant recognition, as though she was someone he had known in another life, foreign to his present. "Emily," he responded, his voice even but devoid of emotion. Her breath caught, hearing his voice after so many years stirred a wave of feelings she had thought long buried. She wanted to explain, to beg for forgiveness, to show him that she was no longer the person who had destroyed their world. "I tried to reach you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wanted to tell you how sorry I am. I was wrong, so terribly wrong." His gaze remained steady, his expression calm, as though her words meant little. He nodded slightly, acknowledging but offering nothing more. "I know I hurt you," she continued, her voice shaking under the weight of regret. "I know I destroyed everything we had, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. I need to know if there's any chance, any small chance, that you could ever forgive me." The silence that followed felt heavy, almost unbearable. The space between them seemed to grow, filling with unspoken words. She searched his face for any sign that her plea had reached him, but David remained unmoved, distant. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "There's nothing left to forgive." The coldness in his words seemed to freeze the air around them, sending a shiver through Emily. This wasn't the forgiveness she had hoped for, nor the closure she had sought all these years. It was the finality in his voice that cut the deepest. He had moved on, leaving her behind in the past, and there was no way back to what once was. Emily opened her mouth, but the words never came. The weight of emotional pain pressed down on her, and tears welled up in her eyes. It wasn't just the betrayal, the lies, or the broken promises that tormented her. What hurt the most was the bitter truth: she had lost the only person who genuinely cared for her. Now standing in front of him, Emily clearly understood there would be no one like him again. David gave her a polite smile, the kind you give to a stranger on the street without saying a word. Without speaking, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing there. She watched as he gradually distanced himself, the sound of his footsteps slowly fading until all she could hear was the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the park. Emily stood for a long time, feeling empty, her thoughts scattered. There was no chance for redemption, no way to rebuild what had been destroyed. She had ruined everything. Meanwhile, David felt an unexpected calm as he walked away. The encounter with Emily had caught him off guard, but it stirred nothing inside him, no anger, no sadness, just peace. His life was moving forward, and he was enjoying this new chapter, far from the ruins of his old one. He had surrounded himself with new friends who appreciated him for who he was, and had found love again. This new relationship was built on mutual respect and kindness, something Emily had never truly given him. His career had taken off, and each day was filled with meaning and fulfillment. The betrayal that once consumed him was now just a distant memory, a closed chapter from a past life. As the sun began to set, casting the park in a warm glow, David smiled to himself. He had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, more resilient. His happiness was his victory, and nothing from the past could take that away. Emily had made her choice, and now he was fully immersed in his own life, free from the shadows that once haunted him. He had found his peace, and in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered, my friend. And this is the end of the story.